Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the food crisis that's hitting specifically a band that stretches from Africa all the way to Yemen, and in particular, four nations, Yemen that we mentioned, but also Somalia, South Sudan, and northeast Nigeria. We're doing so in the company of France 24 correspondent Simona Fulton, who joins us from Dubai. From the Ethiopian capital, Alex Duval, who teaches at Tufts University's Fletcher School. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to the Somali ambassador to France, Ali Sharif Ahmed. And to, as well, in the studio with us, Sheikh Ibn Umar, former Chadian foreign minister and ambassador to the UN. We were talking before the break about the accusations about South Sudan's government not playing along when it comes to reconciliation efforts and obstructing efforts both to feed the people and make peace. The government in South Sudan refuses blame for the possible famine that could ensue.
With accusation that it is responsible for it. It is also important to note that other parts of the country affected by drought as a result of climate change, transitional government of national unity, therefore, take this opportunity to state that it will spare no effort to help address the situation and call upon the international community to assist in addressing the urgent matters.
Simona Fulton, for the American station PBS, you've just come back from South Sudan where you filmed a report there. Your reaction to what the ambassador said, that, hey, look, it's the climate that's to blame for all of this. And what did you see when you were out there on that score?
Well, that's not a very accurate representation of the situation. I mean, it's true that there are pockets of drought in the southeastern parts of the country. And last year we saw some erratic rains in the northwestern parts. So certainly that has contributed. But really, the biggest reason why there is food insecurity in South Sudan is the conflict and is the continued obstruction of humanitarian aid to specific areas. I went to two different parts of South Sudan while I was there, both one of them rebel-held and one of them government-held right now. And the situation was really quite serious. These are people who have been repeatedly displaced due to fighting. They have lost all their possessions. They're not able to farm their fields. They've lost all their livestock. So they're entirely dependent on aid. And this is really attributable largely to the conflict. There has been very little impact of climate change, if any at all, in these areas. So that's not a very accurate statement there.
Not a very accurate statement. Simona, there was a piece last week in the Financial Times by David Pilling where he described, I mean, after all, we're talking about Africa's newest nation, and he said there's only one thing worse than a kleptocracy. It's a bankrupt kleptocracy. He described South Sudan as a place where elites from both sides have turned on each other.
Well, that was true in the beginning of the conflict, but we really have to keep in mind that over the past year and a half or so, I mean, the government has really consolidated its grip on power. It has chased out rebel leader Riek Machar, who was supposed to be part of the transitional government. He has been replaced by Taban Dengai, who is not really recognized by the troops on the ground. So if you look at what has happened in the past year or so, it's really largely the government that is to blame, which is also why I don't agree with the earlier comment that was made that you can't differentiate between a government and opposition forces. I mean, it's true that there has been, to a large extent, a fragmentation of the armed groups, and sometimes it's difficult to recognize whether, is this a militia, is this a government? But that has also been the strategy of the government and of the rebels to some extent, to use militia so that the chain of command is not that easily deciphered by outsiders. So really, if we look at what has happened in the past, in the latter half of the conflict, then you can really put the majority of the blame on the government, not on the rebels, simply not because they're any better, but simply because they were driven out and they have lost a lot of control of territory, and they've lost control over the resources.
Let me ask you this question, Ahmed Sheikh. The independence of South Sudan, 2011. At the time, there were big celebrations. Was it a half-baked idea, giving South Sudan its independence?
No, I think that the tragic event in the whole history, recent history of South Sudan, is the death of the leader, late John Garang, that came at a very wrong time. And this leadership vacuum, you know, is in my view, is the main explication behind all the trouble we have seen, because both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, when Dr. John Garang was alive, there used to be on the margin of the movement, and you may remember that Salva Kiir was put in jail by John Garang for misbehavior, and Riek Machar at some time split away and joined the central government in Khartoum. So my explication is that the vacuum left by the death of John Garang, and there were no national leadership able to fill this vacuum, is the triggering factor for all this situation. But you may add to that the calculation on the part of the neighboring countries, Kenya, Uganda, and the central government in Sudan, to say anything of Ethiopia, and even faraway players like Israel and Arab countries and the United States. So
a lot of it's internal, and some of it is outside players.
Yeah, of course. And the African Union, have been totally absent through the whole thing. They were never, and at the level of the African Union, there were no strong move, toward solving the situation, or at least contributing to the solution.
All right. It's interesting that you bring up Uganda. Before we worry about the spillover effect for Europe, spare a thought for South Sudan's neighbors, and in particular Uganda, where more than 800,000 refugees have now fled. Alex Duval, of course, hindsight's always 2020. What do you think of the concept of South Sudan as a nation?
Well, I must disagree with I beg to disagree with the ambassador. I was part of the African Union team headed by President Thabo Mbeki that was responsible for overseeing the negotiations that led in 2011 to the separation of South Sudan, at that time peaceful, and then the resolution the following year of the border war between South Sudan and Sudan. So the African Union was involved. The African Union was not involved in trying to resolve this current conflict, sadly. Actually, on the day that we mourn the death of the ANC veteran Ahmed Kathrada, we should recall that the President Nelson Mandela died almost on the same day that the conflict broke out in South Sudan, and President Thabo Mbeki, my boss, was in South Africa for that reason, and therefore not in South Sudan. But I think what the South Sudanese demonstrated over their long years of war was that they could not be ruled against their will. And there had to be a government that truly represented the people of South Sudan and their interests. And sadly, the government that came was not such a government. It was a government of kleptocrats, and it was a wealthy country. It had a lot of oil. And people were actually, it had enormous development potential, but that money was very largely stolen. And they turned to fighting one another over these spoils, which are now used up. The country is now deeply in debt, and the government forces that control the majority of the country are now resourcing themselves by stealing from the people, because the oil has very largely gone. So I don't think it was necessarily a bad idea. I think the problem was it was not accompanied by a process of democratic and accountable government. And had that been the case, I think we would have not had the current crisis that we do.
Alex Duval, you're in Ethiopia's capital. When we think of famines in Africa, people think of what happened in the years 1984, 1985. Of course, was that big Live Aid concert that the whole world's attention was captured as a result of that. This time around, Ethiopia, even though there are areas where there are serious food shortages in Ethiopia, the country has avoided the pitfalls of a wide-scale famine. What has Ethiopia done right?
Well, I think Ethiopia demonstrates that drought does not equal famine. I mean, in 30 years ago, there was a drought accompanied by war. About 600,000 people died. The economy shrank by 15%. 18 months ago, there was a much more serious drought. 18 million people were affected. 18 million people in need of emergency food aid. That's actually larger than the crisis we have today. And at the end of it, there is no evidence that anybody died, and the economy continued to grow. It didn't grow as fast as it had been growing, but it grew at a respectable rate of 4 or 5%. And the reason was that immediately that the drought became evident, the government of Ethiopia provided $700 million in assistance to import food, to buy trucks, to use its transport infrastructure, to get assistance to the areas that needed it. The international community then stepped up. International donors provided even more, about $900 million. But it was the Ethiopian government that was first off the blocks in this race. And had they not done so, then the international response always lags. But the Ethiopian response was smart and to the point and extraordinarily effective. And as you said in your opening remarks, we may have many criticisms of the Ethiopian government, but the drought relief response that it mounted was a model of the kind and demonstrated that prompt government action, in this case by the government and if necessary supported by the international community, makes drought not equal to famine. And if I may pick up on something that Ambassador Ali said, yes, the drought in Somalia is a cause of hardship. The reason why it's cause for famine or potential famine is because of the politics and the economics. And let's recall that some 6 years ago, there was a very serious famine in Somalia. It killed perhaps 250,000 people. And the background to that, at the time when Somalia really did not have a functioning government, was that the main source of income to Somalia, which was remittances from the Somali diaspora, was very severely blocked by counterterrorism legislation that put a lot of barriers in the way of Somalis sending money home. And then, when the United Nations and aid agencies in Somalia wanted to respond, counterterrorism legislation, the Patriot Act, meant that should they be involved in any way giving assistance to people who might be associated with the militant group Al-Shabaab, because it's on the terrorist watch list, they could be prosecuted. And so the humanitarian response was impeded for months and months because international agencies would not be ready to provide food to starving people because the group that was controlling them was on the terrorist watch list. And these problems have not been overcome. There's been a workaround. But I mean, the ambassador is, for obvious reasons, reluctant to be too critical of the United States. But the fact is that the US is continuing to put onerous restrictions on remittances going into Somalia, and that counterterrorism legislation, while they found some workarounds, still aid agencies are reluctant to provide aid to starving civilians in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. And of course, I have to add, Al-Shabaab itself is very hostile to agencies, is oppressive, is stealing food aid, is blocking agencies. It is, of course, also very guilty.
Let me ask Ambassador Ahmed about this, because this is a crucial point. Development in Africa has first and foremost come not from governments over the decades, but has come from family members sending home money, what Alex Duval calls remittances there. How hard is it right now for Somalis abroad to send money back to their families in Somalia?
There is a lot of basically, Mr. Alex Duval says, the difficulties, if you will, of sending money to Somalia, particularly family members and Somali diaspora at large. But what is happening at the moment might not be as it used to be. It's very much there's loads of restrictions on hawalas, and because of the war on terror and the countries wanting to find out where this money ends up. But at the same time, the government of Somalia set up and a committee of drought response committee that literally that from diaspora money can be channeled through to them rather than just sending. But
All right, let me put the question to you differently then.
Yeah.
Is it as difficult as it was 6-7 years ago? Has the United States put on as many impositions on sending money home if you wire through, I don't know, Western Union or one of those things, as it was then? Is it the same problem you face if you're trying to send money back to Somalia?
The money hasn't stopped, is still going on. But I think there is monitoring issues in place in particular different countries for the reasons of security, because of in Somalia.
So you're saying there are fewer restrictions than there were then?
There are restrictions, but still remittance is getting through the country and reaching the family members or in this case the emergency drought committees.
Right, that money to help from families is, of course, crucial. It's a very effective way of getting money to those who need it most. But, of course, there is public money. And as the Trump administration considers slashing a quarter of its foreign aid budget, the world's become, in the past year, we mentioned it in part one of our discussion, well, a more dangerous place, more conflicts, more refugees. Much of the attention in Europe is focused on Syria. This graph was published in French broadsheet of record Le Monde. And there you see, if we could call it up again here, the aid needed is increasing faster than the aid that is paid for. Concretely, Simona Fulton, when you were in South Sudan, was the international community doing enough?
Well, they're trying, but they're facing a pretty significant funding shortfall. Currently, they've put forward a funding appeal of $1.6 billion for 2016, and currently only around 18% of that are funded. So that's obviously a huge gap. And there are a lot of fears. I mean, few UN officials will say that on the record, but there are a lot of fears that with the Trump administration slashing their budget, that this gap will not be filled. Of course, the US being one of the biggest funders, actually the biggest funder of emergency relief in South Sudan. So these kind of challenges will likely continue to affect the relief operations.
Sheikh Lumar, of course, the United States is not the only country on the planet. People in the U.S. might say, well, why don't others just pay more?
Well, allow me to go a little back to the climate thing. When I was a student, we learned that in what is called the Ancien Régime in France, the monarchical regime, there used to be a food shortage every 5 years and a full-blown famine every 18 years. So the climate in France and Europe has not changed, or not much. So it is clear that the climate factor is, it is real, but the problem of organization.
But on this issue now of not enough relief aid getting in, and you just heard Simona Fulton talk about it. Whose job is it to make sure there's enough money? Criticism going into the Trump administration for cutting its budget, but is it really just up to the United States to pay for the food aid?
I think that the case put forward by Professor Deval about Ethiopia, it is a very instructive one, because it all boils down to the capacity of organization on the part of the local government. Contributing materially, it is important, but organizing the whole system of, putting the case to the international arena and getting the food and organizing the transportation and, up to the grassroots level, it is very important. Or what we have in all these countries, even in the countries where there is no, violent conflict, there is bad governance, what is called bad governance, and there is no internal capacity for addressing any situation of that kind. So I think that it is very important for the local government and for local association to begin with, making effort to improve the organization at the local level, and starting by contributing to solving the problem on themselves before, asking for external help.
Just very briefly, Alex Duval, because we're almost out of time. You just heard there Sheikh Ibn Umar saying, well, the problem is if you want to stop famine, you need good governance, and good governance starts at home.
Absolutely correct. I mean, my teacher at Oxford, Professor Amartya Sen, famously made the remark that the real factor eliminating famines from India and elsewhere in the world was the growth of democracy. A democratic good government has actually been proven to be the best inoculation against famine.
Alex Duval, many thanks for joining us from Addis Ababa. Simona Fulton from Dubai, Sheikh Ibn Umar, and Ambassador Ahmed. Stay with us because Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
You begin with a story that'll probably be near and dear to the heart of the ambassador.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that we talk a lot about social media and how vacuous the people are who are obsessed with it. But this is a really inspiring story about one man who not only found fame through social media, but is now using it to help the people of Somalia. Jérôme Jarre is a 26-year-old Frenchman, and he actually became famous purely through the use of Vine, a website that no longer is in use, but he used to create these 6-second long videos that you see all the time on social media. And as you can see there, he had 8.6 million followers there. Well, now he's got more than 1 million on Twitter, and he's actually used Twitter to launch a campaign to help the people of Somalia. He called out the mainstream media for not doing enough to talk about the famine that was ongoing there, and he asked Turkish Airlines to help out by providing a flight so that they could fly aid out. That was on the 15th of March. Turkish Airlines got on board very quickly saying, we love Somalia. We got the call for this meaningful flight. And that was less than 2 weeks ago. Now he has done it. He's arrived in Somalia today with that plane load of aid, 60 tons of it, and has immediately begun tweeting about the people that he's met there. And you notice he says, famine has a name. Her name is Muna. She is 5 years old. Because it is very easy when we see the facts and the figures and people in suits talking about famine to forget that these are real people in trouble. And this man has done all that he can to exploit his fame in order to help them. And a lot of people really very touched by his efforts. Some of the other photographs that he's tweeted, he in a way criticised the French policy that says it's too dangerous to travel to Somalia right now, because he said, look at all these smiling faces and all the new friends that he is making today. Lots of people very much in his corner. Jérôme Jarre used a hashtag to fly food and water to Somalia, so storm saver rainwater. And this person saying, I know Jérôme Jarre from Vine. It is inspiring seeing people your own age who get famous for doing nothing, but use that fame to make the world a better place. And it is true. I mean, we talk about Twitter and Facebook, and it is often seen as one of the ills, really, of modern day technology and the world. And we're living virtually, not getting on with real life. But he has really used this to do something pretty amazing. Le Monde has reported on this today, saying in a tweet, a French star of the internet found a plane, filled it with aid, and it's gone to Somalia. However, it's not quite as simple as they make it sound. The cartoonist Sana has actually drawn up the organisation that was involved. And as you can see, there was a GoFundMe campaign. He actually used the Ben Stiller Foundation to sort of run the money through that, because as you see here, they called themselves the Love Army for Somalia, and they've gathered almost $2.4 million to go to Somalia. And Ben Stiller's foundation was actually used to run that money through so that people get money back off their taxes, things like that, all the usual charitable benefits to it. Ben Stiller very heavily involved, still tweeting about it, still trying to get people to actually donate money. One of the other ones who was very quick to get on board was Colin Kaepernick, the football player, best known for staging protests, standing on one knee during the national anthem. But what is interesting as well is that this really got it onto the front pages at a time when, as Jérôme Jarre pointed out, it wasn't getting onto the front pages. The New York Times here last week, break the internet for Somalia, they said.
What was your reaction, Ambassador, when you saw that?
Well, I think it is an excellent and selfless human, endeavor to see a faraway land where he has no connection to it, and then see the starving children, and then he acted the way he did, which is really commendable. And I would say it would be like our Bob Geldof of 2017. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think all we can hope really is that this sets a precedent for the use of social media going forward, being more of a positive kind of thing.
All right. Well, now he's not famous for doing nothing. He's famous for doing something.
Exactly.
James, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Very impressive.